Colorado Territory, 1876. The dust storm that had been gathering strength across the eastern plains now blanketed the Circle, a ranch, in a thick haze of ochre and desperation. Xavier Anderson stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, squinting into the grit-filled wind as it tore at his collar and threatened to rip the hat from his head. At 26, his face still carried the softness of youth, though his emerald green eyes reflected the weariness of a man who'd faced too many hardships too quickly. Xavier ran his hand through his light brown hair, his lean frame tense with frustration. The drought had killed a quarter of his cattle already, and at this rate, he'd lose the rest by winter's end. The ranch, the only thing his father had left him when consumption took him 2 years prior, was slipping through Xavier's fingers like the very soil that blew away with each punishing gust. A man stands alone out here, he muttered to himself, a mantra he'd repeated since burying his father. Trust gets you killed on the frontier. Or worse, it gets you broke. He'd learned that lesson watching his father extend credit to neighbors who never repaid, hiring hands who stole from the stores, and worst of all, marrying a beautiful Eastern woman who couldn't bear the isolation and fled back to Boston when Xavier was just 10. Love was a luxury the West couldn't afford, especially not now, with the banks circling like vultures, waiting for him to miss a payment. What Xavier needed was simply to keep his ranch, to honor his father's memory and prove that an Anderson could tame this wild country. What he told himself he wanted was to be left alone to do it. The sound of hoofbeats pulled him from his thoughts. Through the dust, he made out a carriage struggling along the rutted road that led to his property. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In a dust storm, they were unheard of. Xavier frowned as the carriage drew closer. A slender figure in a traveling dress the color of summer cornflowers emerged, one delicate hand holding down a bonnet against the punishing wind. As the woman approached the porch, Xavier caught his breath. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with golden blonde hair escaping in tendrils from beneath her bonnet. Her face, partially shielded from the dust by a lace-trimmed handkerchief, revealed bright blue eyes that regarded him with a determination that seemed at odds with her refined appearance. Mr. Anderson? Her voice carried a hint of the East in its cultured tones. I'm Louisa Langford, your new neighbor. Xavier stared at her blankly. There must be some mistake. The nearest property for sale is the old Miller place, and that's 20 miles east. The woman, Louisa, smiled, though the expression held a brittleness around the edges. Not anymore. I've purchased the south quarter of your range. The bank was quite accommodating. The words hit Xavier like a physical blow. The south quarter, where his best grazing land and the largest water source on his property lay. That's impossible, he said flatly. That land isn't for sale. Louisa Langford's smile faded. I'm afraid it was, Mr. Anderson. I have the deed right here. She reached into a small leather satchel and extracted a folded document. The bank manager in Denver was quite clear that you'd been notified. Xavier snatched the paper from her hands, scanning the legal language with growing horror. His father had taken a second mortgage on that portion of the property, a fact Xavier had never known. And now, with payments missed, the bank had sold it right out from under him. This is theft, he growled, thrusting the paper back at her. You and whatever land speculator sent you can go straight back to where you came from. Louisa's chin lifted, her expression hardening. No one sent me, Mr. Anderson. I purchased this land with my own money, and I intend to build a life here. Xavier gave a bitter laugh. A life? Out here? Look around you, Miss Langford. This isn't Boston or New York. This land will break you faster than you can unpack your trunks. I'm well aware of the challenges, she replied coolly. Nevertheless, I'm staying. Why? Why this piece of land? Xavier demanded, suspicion darkening his features. There's plenty of property for sale in these parts, property that isn't the heart of someone else's ranch. Louisa hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across her face before she masked it. I have my reasons, Mr. Anderson. Not that they're any of your concern. Xavier stepped closer, towering over her slender frame. Let me make something clear, Miss Langford. I don't know what game you're playing, but I see right through it. You're only here for my ranch, to force me to buy that land back at an inflated price. Well, it won't work. For the first time, Louisa's composure cracked. You don't know the first thing about me or why I'm here. I know your type, Xavier retorted. Eastern vultures swooping in when times get hard. picking at the bones of people who've worked this land with their blood and sweat. The hurt that flashed in Louisa's eyes made Xavier falter for a moment, but he hardened his heart. He'd seen this strategy before. Use a pretty face to soften a man up before striking the final blow. I'll be moving onto my property tomorrow, Mr. Anderson, Louisa said with quiet dignity. I hope in time we can be civil neighbors, if nothing else. She turned and walked back toward her waiting carriage, her shoulders straight despite the buffeting wind. Xavier watched her go, a strange hollowness opening in his chest even as anger burned in his throat. The south quarter was as good as gone, and with it, any hope of saving his ranch. Unless he could convince the stubborn woman that she'd made a terrible mistake in coming to Colorado territory. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the dust storm having blown itself out overnight. Xavier rode the boundary line between what was now Louisa's property and his own, marking the sharp division between his past and his uncertain future. Without access to Cottonwood Creek, he'd have to drive his remaining cattle 5 miles farther to water, a dangerous prospect with the animals already weakened from drought. He crested a small rise and pulled his horse up short. In the distance, where the creek widened into a natural pool, a small tent had been erected. Nearby, Louisa Langford knelt by the water's edge, her golden hair loose down her back, gleaming in the morning sun. She had exchanged her traveling dress for a simpler skirt and shirtwaist, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows as she filled a bucket with water. Xavier urged his horse forward, deliberately making noise to announce his approach. Louisa turned, shading her eyes against the sun. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she called, her voice cautious but not unfriendly. Xavier dismounted, keeping a firm grip on his horse's reins. "This is how you plan to start your new life in the West? With a tent and no protection?" Louisa straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. "It's temporary. I've hired men from town to begin construction on a proper house next week." Xavier glanced at the tent dubiously. "And until then, these parts aren't safe for a woman alone. There are coyotes, wolves, drifters. I'm well armed, Mr. Anderson," Louisa replied, gesturing toward the tent where the butt of a rifle was visible through the open flap. "My father taught me to shoot before I could write my name." Xavier frowned. This didn't fit with his image of an Eastern speculator. "Where is your father now?" A shadow crossed Louisa's face. "He died 6 months ago." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, struck Xavier unexpectedly. He knew that particular grief all too well. "I'm sorry," he said, the words awkward but sincere. Louisa nodded acknowledgement, then bent to lift her now-filled water bucket. Xavier moved forward instinctively, taking it from her hands. "Allow me," he said, carrying it to her campsite. "Look, Miss Langford, please, call me Louisa," she interrupted. "If we're to be neighbors, formality seems unnecessary." Xavier hesitated, then nodded. "Louisa, then. And I'm Xavier." He set the bucket down beside her tent. "I came to tell you that I'll be driving my cattle through your property to reach the North Creek. I have no choice. They need water." He'd expected an argument, perhaps even threats to enforce her property rights. Instead, Louisa's expression softened. "Of course," she said. "I wouldn't dream of preventing your animals from reaching water. This drought has been hard on everyone." Xavier stared at her, caught off guard by her reasonableness. It didn't fit with his theory that she was here to squeeze him financially. "Thank you," he said finally. "But this arrangement can't last. You must know that this property has always been part of Circle A. It makes no sense for it to be separated." Louisa's expression closed. "Nevertheless, it is mine now. I understand your frustration, but I hope you can respect that I have as much right to build something here as you do." Xavier felt his temper rising again. "Build what exactly? Do you know the first thing about ranching? About surviving winters that drop to 20 below? About fighting off rustlers and fending for yourself when the nearest neighbor is half a day's ride away?" "I'm a quick learner," Louisa replied, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "This isn't a game," Xavier pressed. "This is life and death out here. One mistake, and you won't last a season." "Then perhaps," Louisa suggested, her voice tight with controlled emotion, "a neighborly man might offer guidance rather than predictions of failure." The rebuke landed squarely, making Xavier feel churlish and cruel. Still, he couldn't back down. Too much was at stake. "I'll help you pack when you're ready to sell," he said flatly, turning back toward his horse. I won't be selling, Louisa called after him. Not to you or anyone else. I came here to stay, Xavier Anderson, whether you believe it or not. Xavier mounted his horse, tipping his hat sardonically. We'll see about that, Miss Langford. The West has broken stronger souls than yours. As he rode away, Xavier couldn't shake the image of Louisa standing tall beside her lonely tent, golden hair catching the sunlight, a determined set to her delicate jaw. Stronger souls, indeed, but he'd rarely seen one more stubborn. The following weeks brought no rain but plenty of problems. Xavier's cattle grew thinner, and the daily drive to water sapped what little strength they had left. Meanwhile, construction began on Louisa's property, a modest cabin taking shape near the creek, the hammering of nails a constant reminder of the permanent division of his father's land. What confounded Xavier most was Louisa herself. Each time they crossed paths, which happened with increasing frequency as Xavier found himself riding the boundary line more often than strictly necessary, she defied his expectations. Instead of hiring a foreman to manage her new property, she worked alongside the builders, learning to saw boards and drive nails with hands that soon grew calloused. She planted a small vegetable garden behind her tent, rising before dawn to tend it. Most surprisingly, she seemed genuinely interested in learning about ranching. On the third week after her arrival, Xavier found her waiting by the creek as he drove his cattle to water. Mr. Anderson, she called, abandoning formality despite his continued use of her surname. I wonder if I might ask a favor. Xavier dismounted, his curiosity overriding his determination to remain distant. What kind of favor? I've purchased some cattle of my own, she explained. They'll be delivered next week. I was hoping you might show me how to properly care for them. I've read several books, but I suspect practical experience trumps theory in these matters. Xavier couldn't help the startled laugh that escaped him. Books? You're going to ranch cattle based on books? To his surprise, Louisa laughed too, the sound unexpectedly warm and genuine. Absurd, isn't it? But we all start somewhere. My father always said the only true folly is pretending to know what you don't. The mention of her father caught Xavier's attention. What did your father do, if not ranching? A shadow crossed Louisa's face. He was a lawman, a federal marshal. Xavier's eyebrows rose. A marshal's daughter. That explains the shooting skills, at least. He studied her thoughtfully. Why ranching then? Why not stay east where life is easier? Easier isn't always better, Louisa replied, her eyes distant. And I have my reasons for choosing this particular place. Xavier felt his suspicions stirring again. Which you still won't share. Louisa met his gaze directly. Would you believe them if I did? The question caught him off guard with its perception. Would he believe any explanation she offered? Or had he already decided she was an enemy? About these cattle, he said instead of answering. How many head are you getting? 20, Louisa replied. A modest beginning, but all I can manage for now. Xavier nodded slowly. I'll help you get them settled. But not because I approve of what you're doing here. I just don't want to see animals suffer through inexperienced handling. The smile that lit Louisa's face made something twist uncomfortably in Xavier's chest. Thank you. Truly. As he rode away, Xavier told himself firmly that this changed nothing. He still needed his land back, still couldn't survive without the South Quarter. Helping Louisa with her cattle was simply the decent thing to do, and might help him understand her true intentions. What he refused to acknowledge was how often he found himself looking toward her property, how the sight of her working in the late afternoon sun had become a strange comfort in days otherwise filled with worry and resentment. The day Louisa's cattle arrived coincided with the first significant rainfall in months. Xavier rode through the gentle shower to find Louisa already directing the drovers where to unload the animals, a small but healthy-looking herd of Herefords. You chose well, Xavier commented, surveying the cattle with a practiced eye. These should fare better in our winters than Longhorns. Louisa beamed with obvious pride. I did take some advice from the seller, though I'd value your assessment of each animal, if you wouldn't mind. The next few hours passed in a surprisingly companionable routine as Xavier taught Louisa to evaluate cattle for health, temperament, and breeding potential. She proved a quick study, asking intelligent questions and absorbing information with remarkable retention. You're a natural at this, Xavier admitted as they sat together on the newly constructed porch of her cabin, watching the cattle graze on land that was beginning to green slightly with the rain. Not natural, Louisa corrected him with a small smile. Just determined. Xavier studied her profile, noting the determination that squared her delicate jaw. I still don't understand why you're so set on making this work. There are easier places to start a new life. Louisa was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the damp wood of the porch step. My father was killed, she finally said, her voice soft but steady. In the line of duty. He'd been tracking a gang of outlaws for months, the Sutton brothers. Xavier stiffened. The Sutton gang was notorious throughout the territory. 3 brothers who specialized in robbing banks, stage lines, and occasionally wealthy ranches. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate but heartfelt. Louisa nodded. Before he died, he told me they were hiding somewhere in this region. That's why I came. I intend to see them brought to justice. Xavier stared at her, shock replacing his earlier compassion. You came here hunting outlaws? Alone? Are you mad? Anger flashed in Louisa's eyes. I came to ensure information about their whereabouts reaches the proper authorities. I'm not planning to confront them myself. Even being connected to such information could get you killed, Xavier argued. These men don't hesitate to eliminate witnesses or anyone they consider a threat. I'm aware of the risks, Louisa replied, her voice tightening. But I made a promise at my father's grave. I won't break it. Xavier ran a hand through his hair in frustration. So this land purchase, it has nothing to do with ranching at all? It's just a convenient location for your manhunt. Hurt flashed across Louisa's face. No, that's not it at all. I always wanted a ranch of my own. My father and I used to talk about starting one together after he retired. Her voice softened with memory. When I learned this property was available, it seemed like fate. I could honor my promise to my father and build the life we'd planned, just without him beside me. The simple honesty in her words struck Xavier deeply. He'd been so convinced of her mercenary intentions that he'd never considered she might have dreams of her own, dreams that had nothing to do with him or his problems. Louisa, he began, unsure what to say but feeling the need to say something, when a distant crack of gunfire cut through the gentle patter of rain. Both of them were on their feet instantly. 3 riders were approaching from the east, moving fast despite the muddy ground. Get inside, Xavier ordered, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Louisa disappeared into the cabin, emerging moments later with her rifle. I told you. I can shoot, she said firmly, taking position beside him. The riders slowed as they approached, and Xavier felt his shoulders tighten with recognition. The man in the lead was Joseph Sutton, the youngest and most volatile of the Sutton brothers. Well, Sutton called as they drew up 20 yards from the porch. Heard there was a new neighbor in these parts. Didn't expect such a pretty one. Xavier stepped slightly in front of Louisa. What do you want, Sutton? Joseph Sutton's unshaven face split in a grin that never reached his eyes. Just being neighborly, Anderson. Thought we'd introduce ourselves to the lady. His gaze shifted to Louisa. Joseph Sutton, miss. My brothers and I have property north of here. Xavier felt Louisa stiffen beside him, but was impressed when her voice remained steady. Miss Langford, I'd say it's a pleasure, but I try not to lie before supper. Sutton's smile faded. Got a sharp tongue on her, doesn't she? Might want to teach your woman some manners, Anderson. I'm not his woman, Louisa replied coolly. And I don't need teaching. Xavier suppressed a groan at her defiance. Antagonizing the Suttons was never wise. We're in the middle of work here, he interjected. Was there something specific you needed? Joseph Sutton's eyes narrowed. Just making sure the lady understands how things work in these parts. Folks mind their own business if they want to stay healthy. His gaze locked with Louisa's, especially folks with lawmen for kin. Xavier felt Louisa's sharp intake of breath, though her expression remained impressively neutral. I'll keep that in mind, she said evenly. Sutton nodded, clearly disappointed at failing to provoke a stronger reaction. See that you do? We'll be keeping an eye on you, Miss Langford. He tipped his hat mockingly. Welcome to Colorado territory. The 3 men wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving Xavier and Louisa standing tensely on the porch. They know who you are, Xavier said quietly once the riders were out of earshot. They know why you're here. Louisa's face had gone pale, but her grip on her rifle remained steady. It seems so. You need to leave, Xavier urged. Today, pack what you can and get back to Denver before dark. Louisa turned to him, her blue eyes flashing with sudden fire. I will not be intimidated into abandoning my home. Not by them, and not by you. This isn't about intimidation, Xavier snapped, genuine fear making his voice harsh. This is about staying alive. The Suttons don't make idle threats. Neither do I, Louisa retorted. I promised to see justice done, and I will. Xavier stared at her in frustration. At what cost? Your life, if necessary. Louisa's voice softened. Though I'd prefer to avoid that outcome if possible. Despite his worry, Xavier found himself fighting a reluctant smile at her dry humor. You are the most stubborn woman I've ever met. So I've been told, Louisa replied, a hint of warmth returning to her expression. Usually right before someone concedes defeat. Xavier shook his head, his earlier resentment now completely overshadowed by concern for her safety. I'm staying here tonight, he declared. The Suttons might return, and I won't leave you alone to face them. Surprise flickered across Louisa's face. That's not necessary. It is, Xavier insisted. I'll sleep on the porch, just until we're sure they've moved on. After a moment, Louisa nodded. Thank you. She hesitated, then added softly. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the whole truth from the beginning. I wasn't sure who I could trust. And now? Xavier asked, suddenly needing to know where he stood in her estimation. Louisa met his gaze steadily. Now I think perhaps I've found at least one person in these parts who isn't what he first appears to be. Xavier looked away, uncomfortable with the gentle assessment that saw too much. I'll fetch my bedroll from my saddlebags. As he turned to his horse, Xavier was forced to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. His determination to drive Louisa Langford away had somehow transformed into an equally powerful determination to protect her, regardless of what it might cost him. Xavier awoke before dawn to the sound of soft movement inside the cabin. He sat up from his makeshift bed on the porch, hand automatically reaching for his revolver before he recognized Louisa's silhouette through the window. She emerged a moment later, dressed for riding, her golden hair braided and pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Early start, Xavier asked, rising to his feet. Louisa nodded. I need to check on my cattle. After yesterday's excitement, I want to make sure they haven't scattered. I'll ride with you, Xavier offered, reaching for his boots. Louisa's hesitation was brief but noticeable. That's very kind, but unnecessary. I'm sure you have your own ranch to attend to. Xavier frowned. Something in her manner seemed off, too casual, too dismissive. My men can handle things for a few hours. After yesterday's visit, I'd feel better keeping an eye on your property. Louisa's expression softened. I appreciate your concern, truly, but I need to get used to managing on my own. Before Xavier could argue further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Two riders were coming up the road, not from the direction of town, but from the wild country to the north. Xavier moved in front of Louisa, drawing his revolver. Get back inside. No, Louisa countered, already reaching for her rifle. I won't hide in my own home. As the riders drew closer, Xavier relaxed slightly. It wasn't the Suttons, but Sheriff Taylor from the county seat, accompanied by a deputy Xavier didn't recognize. Morning, Anderson, the sheriff called as they drew up to the cabin. Miss Langford. Louisa stepped forward. Sheriff, what brings you out this way? The older man dismounted stiffly. Got word the Suttons were seen in these parts yesterday. Thought I'd check on our newest resident. His shrewd eyes took in Xavier's bedroll on the porch, and his expression grew knowing. Though it seems you've found protection already. Xavier felt heat rise in his face. It's not what you're thinking, Sheriff. Miss Langford had some trouble with the Suttons yesterday. I stayed to make sure they didn't return. Sheriff Taylor nodded, though his skeptical expression remained. Well, that's what I'm here about. We've got reason to believe the Suttons are planning something big, possibly at the bank in Willow Creek. I've got men watching the town, but I wanted to warn folks in the outlying areas to stay alert. Thank you for the warning, Louisa said, her voice carefully neutral. The sheriff studied her thoughtfully. Miss Langford, I understand you had some connection to Marshal Langford back east. Any relation? Xavier saw Louisa tense slightly. He was my father. Sheriff Taylor nodded slowly. Fine man. His death was a great loss to the law enforcement community. He paused, his gaze sharpening. Strange coincidence, you settling so close to where we suspect the Suttons have been hiding out. Is it? Louisa replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I wasn't aware the Marshal Service had any specific intelligence on their location. The sheriff's eyes narrowed at her careful phrasing. They don't officially, but rumors get around. And now here you are, and suddenly the Suttons are making social calls. Xavier stepped forward. Sheriff, what exactly are you suggesting? Not suggesting anything, Taylor replied mildly. Just observing that coincidences make me nervous. He turned back to Louisa. Miss Langford, if you have information about the Suttons that might help us apprehend them, now would be the time to share it. Louisa's expression remained impassive. If I had such information, Sheriff, I would certainly pass it along through appropriate channels. Sheriff Taylor sighed. Well, that's about what I expected. He tipped his hat. Just be careful. The Suttons have killed 6 men that we know of, including your father. They wouldn't hesitate to add a woman to that tally if they felt threatened. After the sheriff and his deputy rode away, Xavier turned to Louisa. You do have information, don't you? That's why you were dressed for riding so early. You were planning to look for their hideout. Louisa didn't deny it. My father's last letter mentioned an abandoned mine in the hills north of here. He believed that's where they were hiding between robberies. Xavier stared at her in disbelief. And you were going to search for it? Alone. I was going to observe from a distance, Louisa corrected. If I found anything suspicious, I planned to send word to the U.S. Marshal in Denver. It's still too dangerous, Xavier insisted. These men killed your father, a trained lawman with years of experience. What chance would you have if they caught you spying on them? Louisa's chin lifted stubbornly. I'm not asking for your permission, Xavier. No, you're just risking your life on a fool's errand. He snapped, genuine fear making his words harsher than intended. Is revenge worth dying for? This isn't about revenge, Louisa retorted, genuine anger flashing in her eyes. It's about justice. About finishing what my father started so that no one else loses someone they love to these men. Xavier ran a hand through his hair in frustration. At least wait until we have more information. The sheriff said they're planning something in Willow Creek. Let the law handle this. Louisa's expression softened slightly. I appreciate your concern, but I made a promise. Then I'm coming with you, Xavier declared, the words escaping before he could consider their implications. Louisa's eyes widened in surprise. What about your ranch? Your cattle? My foreman can manage for a day, Xavier replied, already mentally reorganizing his responsibilities. Besides, 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. And, he added with grim humor, if you're determined to get yourself killed, someone should be there to bring your body back for a proper burial. To his surprise, Louisa laughed, a genuine, warm sound that transformed her face and sent an unexpected jolt through Xavier's chest. Well, when you put it so charmingly, how can I refuse? She asked, eyes sparkling with a mixture of humor and something warmer that Xavier wasn't ready to name. We'll leave in an hour. I need to check my cattle first. As Xavier watched her walk toward the small corral behind her cabin, he was struck by the realization that his priorities had shifted drastically in the few weeks since her arrival. The ranch, his father's legacy, was still paramount in his mind, but now, somehow, ensuring Louisa Langford's safety had become equally important. The thought was both unsettling and oddly comforting, like finding solid ground after months of uncertainty. They rode north through terrain that grew increasingly rugged, following game trails that wound between rocky outcroppings and stands of pine. Xavier kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign they were being followed, while Louisa navigated with surprising confidence for someone new to the territory. My father included a rough map in his last letter, she explained when Xavier commented on her sure sense of direction. He'd spent weeks tracking the Suttons' movements, narrowing down the location of their hideout. Xavier frowned. If the Marshal Service had this information, why haven't they acted on it? Louisa's expression darkened. Politics. The Suttons have connections, powerful ones. There are rumors that certain officials have been paid to look the other way. She glanced at Xavier. That's partly why I came myself. I don't trust the information to reach the right people through official channels. Xavier digested this sobering reality. Your father must have been an exceptional man. He was, Louisa agreed softly. Stubborn, principled to a fault, and completely dedicated to justice. Even when it cost him everything. A shadow crossed her face, including his marriage. My mother couldn't bear the danger and uncertainty of his profession. She left when I was 12. The parallel to Xavier's own childhood struck him forcefully. My mother left too, he found himself saying. The isolation of ranch life was too much for her. She went back east when I was 10. Louisa's gaze met his, understanding passing between them without words. It shapes you, doesn't it? Learning so young that love isn't always enough to make people stay. Xavier nodded, surprised by how accurately she'd articulated the lesson he'd carried into adulthood. It taught me to rely only on myself, to expect that people will leave when things get difficult. And yet here you are, Louisa observed quietly, risking yourself for someone you barely know and have every reason to resent. Xavier looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. I'm just being a good neighbor. Louisa smiled slightly, but didn't press the point. We should leave the horses here and continue on foot. The mine entrance should be just over that ridge, according to my father's map. They secured their horses in a sheltered hollow and proceeded cautiously, moving from one patch of cover to the next. As they crested the ridge, Xavier caught Louisa's arm, pulling her down beside him behind a large boulder. Below them, partially concealed by pines, was the abandoned mine entrance, and outside it, 3 horses were tethered beside a small campfire where 2 men sat cleaning weapons. The Suttons, Xavier whispered, recognizing Joseph and the eldest brother, William. Louisa nodded, her face pale but determined. We need to get closer, see if the 3rd brother is inside, find out what they're planning. Xavier frowned. We've confirmed the location. That's enough. We should go back to town, alert the sheriff. They could be gone by then, Louisa argued. This might be our only chance to gather enough evidence to convince the Marshal Service to act. Before Xavier could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. A 4th rider approached the camp, not the missing Sutton brother, but a well-dressed man Xavier recognized with shock. That's Edward Harrington, he whispered. He's the banker in Willow Creek. They watched as Harrington dismounted and joined the Suttons by the fire, his manner nervous but familiar, suggesting this wasn't their first meeting. I told you I can't do it, they heard Harrington say, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. The payroll shipment has been delayed. It won't arrive until next week. That's not what we agreed, William Sutton replied, his tone dangerously calm. We have plans that depend on that money being available tomorrow. It's out of my control, Harrington protested. The stage was held up in Denver. Joseph Sutton laughed unpleasantly. Ironic, isn't it? Someone else robbing what we planned to steal. Keep your voice down, his elder brother snapped. Mr. Harrington, perhaps you could offer an alternative. Something to compensate us for this inconvenience. The banker paled visibly. There's nothing else of significant value in the safe. Unless, he hesitated. Unless. William prompted. There are land deeds, Harrington said reluctantly. Some quite valuable. The south quarter of the Anderson Ranch, for instance, was recently sold to a young woman from back east. The transaction funds are being held in escrow at my bank. Xavier felt Louisa tense beside him. Anderson's place? Joseph said with interest. That's where that pretty blonde has set up. The Marshal's daughter. William Sutton's expression sharpened. Marshal Langford's daughter? The one who's been asking questions about us all over the territory. Harrington nodded nervously. The same. Miss Louisa Langford. She's paid for the land, but the final paperwork hasn't been filed yet. Technically, those funds are still accessible. How much? William asked. $5,000. Joseph whistled low. That would ease the disappointment of missing the payroll. William nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. And eliminating the Marshal's nosy daughter would be a satisfying bonus. He turned to Harrington. Have the money ready by tomorrow noon. We'll handle the rest. Xavier glanced at Louisa, whose face had gone white with anger and fear. He gripped her arm in warning, sensing her desire to confront the men who were so casually discussing both stealing her money and ending her life. They retreated carefully, making their way back to their horses without being detected. Only when they were a safe distance away did Xavier speak. They're planning to rob your escrow account and kill you, he said bluntly. We need to get back to town and warn the sheriff. Louisa nodded, her expression grim. Now we have proof of Harrington's involvement. He's been their inside man all along, probably warning them about shipments, helping them avoid the law. Xavier helped her mount her horse. It explains how they've managed to evade capture for so long. With someone respectable vouching for them, suspicion would fall elsewhere. As they rode back toward town, a heavy silence fell between them. Xavier found himself watching Louisa from the corner of his eye, struck by her composure in the face of such a direct threat. "I owe you an apology," he said finally as they entered more familiar territory. Louisa looked at him questioningly. "For what?" "For doubting your motives. For assuming the worst about you." Xavier met her gaze directly. "I was wrong about you, Louisa. Completely wrong." A small smile touched her lips. "Not completely. I did come here with ulterior motives, just not the ones you suspected." "You came seeking justice," Xavier acknowledged. "Not to take my ranch." "Never that," Louisa confirmed softly. "Though I won't pretend I wasn't aware of how much that land meant to you. It made it a difficult decision." Xavier frowned. "Then why go through with it? Why not purchase land elsewhere?" Louisa hesitated. "Because my father's information specified that particular location. He believed the sight lines from that property would be crucial to observing the Suttons' movements." She glanced at Xavier apologetically. "I needed that specific piece of land to fulfill my promise to him." Understanding dawned on Xavier, along with a surprising lack of resentment. "You needed my south quarter because it had the best view of the northern hills, where the mine is located." Louisa nodded. "I'm sorry I couldn't explain earlier. I didn't know if I could trust you, and I couldn't risk word getting back to the Suttons about my true purpose here." "And now?" Xavier asked, echoing her earlier question. "Do you trust me now?" Louisa's gaze met his, warm and direct. "With my life, it seems. Since that's precisely what I'm doing at this moment." The simple statement struck Xavier deeply. Trust wasn't something either of them extended easily, he realized. Yet here they were, riding side by side toward danger, each relying on the other in ways neither had anticipated. "We'll stop them," he promised. Together. Sheriff Taylor listened to their account with grave attention, his weathered face darkening as they described the conversation they'd overheard. "Harrington," he said when they'd finished. "I should have suspected. He's been in financial trouble for years, gambling debts in Denver, from what I hear." "Will you arrest him?" Louisa asked. "And the Suttons?" The sheriff sighed heavily. "Harrington, yes. I've got enough on him from your testimony. But the Suttons are another matter. They're dangerous, well-armed, and they'll be expecting trouble now." "So you'll do nothing?" Xavier demanded incredulously. "I didn't say that," Taylor replied, his voice sharpening. "I said I'll need to be careful. I've sent my deputy to gather a posse, but it will take time. These men have killed law officers before, your father included, Miss Langford. I won't risk more lives by rushing in unprepared." Louisa's expression was tight with controlled emotion. "While you prepare, Sheriff, the Suttons will come for me, and for my money. They made that quite clear. I could put you on the next stage to Denver," the sheriff offered. "Get you safely away until this is resolved." Xavier wasn't surprised when Louisa shook her head firmly. "I won't run. This ends here, one way or another." Sheriff Taylor studied her with grudging respect. "You're very much your father's daughter, aren't you?" He turned to Xavier. "And you, Anderson? This isn't your fight." Xavier's response came without hesitation. "It became my fight when they threatened my neighbor." He glanced at Louisa, something warming in his chest at the gratitude in her eyes. "Besides, someone needs to make sure she doesn't get herself killed trying to single-handedly capture 3 armed outlaws." The sheriff chuckled despite the gravity of the situation. "Fair enough. Here's what we'll do. I'll arrest Harrington immediately, before he can warn the Suttons. Then we'll set a trap at the bank. If they come for the money as planned, we'll be waiting. And if they decide to come for me directly?" Louisa asked. Taylor's expression darkened. "That's why I'd prefer you leave town. But since you're determined to stay, we'll need to be prepared for that possibility too." "She'll stay at my ranch tonight," Xavier declared. "It's defensible, and I have men who can help keep watch." Louisa started to protest, but Xavier cut her off gently. "It's the sensible option, Louisa. Your cabin is isolated and impossible to defend properly." After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Very well, but I want to be part of whatever happens tomorrow. These men killed my father. I won't be sheltered from seeing justice done." The sheriff and Xavier exchanged resigned glances. "Stubborn as a mountain mule," Taylor muttered. "Fine, but you follow orders, understand? No heroics." Louisa's expression was solemn. "I understand." As they left the sheriff's office, Xavier found himself studying Louisa with new eyes. The delicate-looking woman he'd first dismissed as an Eastern interloper had proven herself braver and more principled than most men he knew. Her determination to see justice done, even at great personal risk, stirred something in him that had been dormant since his father's death. A belief that some things were worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. "What?" Louisa asked, noticing his scrutiny as they collected their horses. Xavier shook his head slightly. "Just wondering what your father would think about all this." A sad smile touched Louisa's lips. "He'd be furious that I put myself in danger, and proud that I stood my ground." She mounted her horse with practiced grace, much like someone else I've come to know recently. Xavier felt warmth spread through his chest at the gentle assessment. Without another word, they rode toward his ranch, both aware that tomorrow would bring either justice or tragedy, and that neither of them would face it alone. Night fell over the Circle A ranch, bringing with it a tense quiet. Xavier had positioned his ranch hands at strategic points around the property, each armed and alert for any sign of the Suttons. Inside the main house, Louisa sat by the fire in Xavier's father's old chair, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands as she stared into the flames. "You should try to get some sleep," Xavier suggested, entering from his final check of the perimeter. "Tomorrow will come early enough." Louisa looked up, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "I'm not sure I could sleep if I tried. Too many thoughts." Xavier settled in the chair opposite hers, understanding her restlessness. "Want to share them?" For a moment, he thought she might decline. Then she sighed softly. "I keep thinking about my father, about whether he would approve of what I'm doing." "Seeking justice for his murder?" Xavier asked. "I can't imagine he'd disapprove of that." "Not just that," Louisa replied, her gaze returning to the fire. "This place, the ranch, building a life here." She hesitated. "When we talked about starting a ranch together, it was always supposed to be after he retired, after he'd completed his duty. I sometimes wonder if I've betrayed that by putting my own dreams first." Xavier considered her words carefully. "From what you've told me about him, your father sounds like a man who understood sacrifice, but also one who wanted happiness for his daughter." He leaned forward, catching her gaze. "You haven't abandoned his cause, Louisa. You've pursued it while also building something lasting, something that honors the future you plan together." Tears shimmered in Louisa's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "Thank you for that." She took a deep breath. "What about you, Xavier? What did your father want for you?" The question caught him off guard. "To keep the ranch, to make it prosperous." He paused, remembering conversations from his youth. "And to find someone to share it with, someone who understood what this land means, who would love it as he did." He always said a ranch was just land and cattle without family to give it purpose. "Wise man," Louisa observed softly. Xavier nodded, memories washing over him. "He was. After my mother left, he never remarried, never even looked at another woman that I saw. But he always told me not to make his mistakes, not to let pride or fear keep me from opening my heart when the right person came along." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "It's strange," Louisa said after a long moment. "A month ago, we were strangers, adversaries, even. And now?" Xavier prompted when she fell silent. Louisa met his gaze directly. "Now I'm not sure what we are, but I know I'm grateful you're beside me in this fight." Xavier felt something shift between them, a boundary dissolving, a possibility opening. Before he could respond, however, a sharp whistle from outside interrupted the moment. One of his men signaling. Xavier was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand. "Stay here," he ordered, moving to the window. Through the darkness, he could make out 3 riders approaching slowly from the north, not trying to conceal their presence, but moving with deliberate purpose. The Suttons, he confirmed grimly. All 3 of them. Louisa had already retrieved her rifle. So much for waiting until tomorrow to rob the bank. They must have gotten word of Harrington's arrest, Xavier surmised. Decided to change plans. He crossed to the fireplace and extinguished the lamps, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the dying embers of the fire. Outside, his men would be moving into the positions they'd prepared, ready to defend the house. "They're coming for me," Louisa said, her voice steady despite the fear Xavier could sense beneath it. "This is my fight." Xavier turned to her, barely visible in the dim light. "It's our fight now. I won't let them hurt you, Louisa." She reached out, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I know." The simple touch, the trust it conveyed, sent warmth through Xavier despite the danger facing them. For a brief moment, He allowed himself to imagine a future beyond tomorrow, a future where Louisa remained on the land adjacent to his, where their lives continued to intertwine, where the barriers between them dissolved completely. Then the sound of approaching horses grew louder, and reality reasserted itself harshly. "Get down," Xavier whispered as the first shots rang out, shattering the front window. The battle that followed was chaotic and terrifying. The Suttons, clearly expecting to find Louisa alone and vulnerable, instead encountered determined resistance from Xavier and his men. Gunfire echoed across the previously peaceful ranch, bullets splintering wood and shattering glass. Xavier and Louisa moved from window to window, firing carefully placed shots to keep the attackers at bay. Through it all, Xavier was aware of Louisa's steady presence beside him, her hands firm on her rifle, her breathing controlled despite the danger. "They're trying to reach the back door," Louisa warned as she spotted movement in the shadows. Xavier nodded grimly. "Johnson and Miller are positioned there. They won't get through easily." No sooner had he spoken than a cry of pain rang out. One of his men hit. The balance of the fight shifted instantly. "They're coming in," Xavier said, pulling Louisa toward the stairs. "We need higher ground." They retreated to the upper floor, taking position at the top of the staircase just as the back door splintered inward. Heavy footsteps moved through the kitchen, accompanied by Joseph Sutton's mocking voice. "Come out! Come out, Marshall's daughter," he called. "No need to make this harder than it has to be." Louisa's grip tightened on her rifle, but her voice was steady when she replied. "You murdered my father, Joseph Sutton. If you want me, you'll have to come and get me." Xavier gave her a quick nod of approval before taking aim at the doorway to the main room. When William Sutton's figure appeared, Xavier fired, forcing him back into cover. "That you, Anderson?" William called. "Should have known you'd be protecting her. Always had a soft spot for pretty faces, didn't you?" "I have a soft spot for justice," Xavier replied, keeping his voice calm despite the fury burning in his chest. "Something you wouldn't understand." A harsh laugh was the only response before more gunfire erupted, forcing Xavier and Louisa to duck behind the heavy oak railing. "We can't hold them off forever," Louisa whispered, reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. Xavier nodded grimly. "The sheriff should have heard the shooting by now. If we can just hold out a little longer." His words were cut short as the third Sutton brother, previously unseen, fired from an unexpected angle through the window of the upstairs bedroom. The bullet grazed Xavier's arm, causing him to drop his revolver with a hiss of pain. Louisa reacted instantly, swinging her rifle toward the new threat and firing in one fluid motion. There was a cry of pain, and the shadowy figure at the window disappeared. "I got him," she breathed, a mixture of shock and determination in her voice. Before Xavier could respond, heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. Joseph Sutton appeared at the top, his gun aimed directly at Louisa. "Drop it," he snarled, gesturing at her rifle. Louisa hesitated, her weapon still half raised. "Drop it, or I put a bullet in Anderson's head," Joseph elaborated, shifting his aim to Xavier. Slowly, reluctantly, Louisa lowered her rifle to the floor. "Slide it over," Joseph ordered. When she complied, he smiled unpleasantly. "Good girl. Now both of you on your feet. William wants to have a word before we finish this." They were forced downstairs at gunpoint to where William Sutton waited in Xavier's living room, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder where Xavier's earlier shot had found its mark. "Marshall Langford's daughter," William said, studying Louisa with cold eyes. "You have caused us considerable inconvenience." Louisa met his gaze unflinchingly. "As did my father, I imagine, before you shot him in the back." William's expression hardened. "Your father was a fool who didn't know when to stop. A family trait, it seems." "Where's the third one?" Joseph asked, glancing around nervously. "Matthew should have come down by now." "Your brother won't be coming," Louisa replied evenly. "Not unless he can walk with a bullet in him." William's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You'll pay for that. But first," he turned to Xavier. "Where's the deed to the south quarter? The land you sold this woman?" Xavier frowned in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "That land belongs to Miss Langford now. The deed is registered at the bank." "Not according to our friend Harrington," William countered. "He says the final paperwork hasn't been filed. That means whoever holds the physical deed controls the property and the money in escrow." Understanding dawned on Xavier. This isn't just about silencing Louisa. You want her land. William shrugged. Why not? That creek access is valuable. And with you both dead, who's to say the property wasn't legally sold to us before your unfortunate accident? The deed is at the bank, Louisa insisted. In Mr. Harrington's safe. Liar, William hissed. Harrington told us Anderson would have the original until the filing was complete. Now where is it? Xavier and Louisa exchanged glances, both realizing the same thing. Harrington had lied to the Suttons, either out of desperation or as part of some double-cross. The deed was indeed at the bank, properly filed and recorded. It's in my desk, Xavier said suddenly, nodding toward the heavy oak desk in the corner. Bottom drawer. William gestured with his gun. Get it. Slowly. Xavier moved toward the desk, mind racing for a way to turn the situation to their advantage. As he pulled open the drawer, he caught a glimpse through the window of movement outside, riders approaching quietly from the direction of town. I don't see it, he said, stalling for time as he rummaged through papers. It must be in another drawer. Joseph stepped closer, impatient. Stop wasting time, Anderson. As Xavier straightened, his hand closed around a letter opener hidden beneath the papers. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. You know, he said conversationally, there's something you Suttons never seem to understand about this territory. William raised an eyebrow. And what's that? People look out for their neighbors here, Xavier replied. In one swift movement, he hurled the letter opener at Joseph while diving toward Louisa, knocking her to the floor as gunfire erupted from outside. The sheriff and his posse had arrived, surrounding the house and firing through windows and doorways. In the chaos, William Sutton raised his gun toward Xavier and Louisa where they lay exposed on the floor. Louisa reacted first, rolling away from Xavier's protective grasp and reaching for her fallen rifle. She fired a single shot just as William pulled his trigger. The outlaw's bullet splintered the floorboard inches from Xavier's head as William Sutton crumpled, Louisa's shot finding its mark. Joseph, wounded by one of the posse's bullets, attempted to flee out the back door, only to be met by Sheriff Taylor himself. The confrontation ended swiftly, and as quickly as it had begun, the battle was over. In the sudden silence, Xavier turned to Louisa, who still knelt on the floor, her rifle clutched tightly in trembling hands. Are you hurt? He asked urgently, reaching for her. She shook her head mutely, allowing him to help her to her feet. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite her pale face. It's over. They're gone. Xavier nodded, suddenly aware of how close they stood, of his hands still holding her arms, of the life that might have been lost tonight. Hers, or his, or both. Louisa, he began, not entirely sure what he meant to say, only knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them. Sheriff Taylor's entrance interrupted whatever might have followed. Miss Langford. Anderson. You both all right? Xavier reluctantly released Louisa, turning to the sheriff. We're unharmed. Thanks to your timely arrival. Taylor nodded grimly. And thanks to your neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. She heard the shooting and rode to town to fetch us. He surveyed the destruction around them. Quite a mess you've got here. Worth it, Xavier replied simply, his gaze returning to Louisa. The sheriff looked between them, a knowing expression crossing his weathered face. I'll need statements from both of you, but it can wait till morning. He tipped his hat. Good night, folks. My men will handle the bodies. As the sheriff departed, leaving them alone in the bullet-riddled room, Xavier felt the weight of the night's events settle upon him. He'd come so close to losing everything. His life, his ranch, and most surprisingly, the woman who had somehow become essential to both. I was wrong about you, he said finally, breaking the silence. From the very beginning, when I said you were only here for my ranch. Louisa stepped closer, placing her fingers gently against his lips to stop his words. You weren't entirely wrong, Xavier. I did come for the land, just not for the reasons you thought. She smiled softly, and not knowing what else I would find here. Xavier caught her hand in his, holding it against his chest where his heart beat with new purpose. And now that the Suttons are gone and your father's killers brought to justice, will you stay? The question hung between them, weighted with all that remained unspoken, his growing feelings for her, the future he had begun to imagine with her beside him. Louisa's blue eyes searched his face, as though memorizing every feature. I bought that land to fulfill a promise, she said slowly. But I've come to love it for itself, for the life it offers. She hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. For the neighbor who has shown me what it truly means to belong somewhere. Xavier felt hope rise in his chest, warm and bright as sunrise over the prairie. Then stay, he whispered, drawing her closer. Stay and build your ranch. Stay and help me rebuild mine. Stay and... He paused, suddenly aware of how much he was asking, how quickly things had changed between them. Louisa smiled, the expression transforming her tired face into something radiant. And, she prompted softly, and see if what's growing between us might become something as enduring as the land we both love. Xavier finished, his voice rough with emotion. Instead of answering with words, Louisa rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but filled with promise, of healing, of home, of a future neither had imagined when they first met. When they separated, Xavier kept her close, unwilling to break the connection between them. Is that a yes? He asked, a smile tugging at his lips. Louisa laughed, the sound bright and clear in the bullet-scarred room. That, Xavier Anderson, is most definitely a yes. Spring brought renewal to the Colorado territory. The drought broke with gentle rains that turned the prairie vibrant green and filled the creeks to overflowing. On the south quarter of what had once been Circle A Ranch, a new house stood nearly complete, larger than Louisa's original cabin, but still modest by Eastern standards. Xavier watched from horseback as Louisa directed the placement of window glass in what would become their home after next month's wedding. The past 6 months had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. The notoriety of the Sutton gang's demise had brought unexpected attention to their remote corner of the territory, including interest from a cattle buyer who had offered Xavier a contract that would secure the ranch's future for years to come. Louisa, meanwhile, had thrown herself into ranching with characteristic determination. Her small herd of cattle had nearly doubled under Xavier's guidance, and she'd proven to have a natural eye for breeding stock that impressed even the most skeptical local ranchers. But the most profound transformation had been between them. What began as suspicion had blossomed into respect, then friendship, and finally a love neither had believed possible when they first met. They had faced death together and emerged with a bond that seemed unbreakable. Xavier dismounted as Louisa noticed his approach, her face lighting with the smile that still made his heart stutter in his chest. "What do you think?" she asked, gesturing to the house. "Will it do?" Xavier surveyed the solid structure, built from local timber and stone, designed to withstand both harsh winters and the occasional summer storm. "It's perfect," he said honestly. "Strong. Beautiful." His gaze returned to her face. "Like its owner." Louisa laughed, linking her arm through his as they walked toward the building that would soon be their home. "Soon to be co-owner," she corrected. "Once we're married, what's mine is yours, including this troublesome south quarter you were so determined to reclaim." Xavier smiled, remembering his earlier hostility with a mixture of amusement and chagrin. "I was a fool." "You were protecting what you loved," Louisa countered gently. "As was I." She stopped, turning to face him. "We're not so different, you and I. Both shaped by loss. Both determined to honor our father's legacies in our own ways." Xavier touched her cheek tenderly. "Both finding something we never expected." "Speaking of unexpected," Louisa said, her expression turning serious. "I received a letter from the U.S. Marshal's office this morning. They're presenting my father with a posthumous commendation for his role in bringing down the Sutton gang. They've invited me to Denver for the ceremony next month." Xavier squeezed her hand. "We'll go together. Right after the wedding." Louisa's eyes brightened with unshed tears. "He would have liked you, you know, despite your first impression that I was some kind of land-grabbing opportunist." Xavier laughed, pulling her into his arms. "And your father would have been right about that, too. You did grab my land, and my heart along with it." As they stood together on the land that had once divided them, now the foundation of their shared future, Xavier reflected on how completely his life had changed since that dust-blown day when Louisa Langford first arrived on his doorstep. The false belief he'd carried since childhood, that love wasn't meant for the harsh reality of frontier life, that trusting others only led to pain, had been thoroughly disproven by the remarkable woman in his arms. "Do you remember?" Louisa asked softly. What you said to me that first day. You're only here for my ranch, you said. You were so angry, so certain you knew my intentions. Xavier nodded, remembering his harsh words with regret. I was wrong about everything. Not everything, Louisa corrected, her blue eyes sparkling with mischief and love. I didn't want your ranch. I just didn't know I wanted the rancher too. Xavier laughed, lifting her off her feet in a joyful embrace that spoke of all they'd overcome and all they had yet to build together. As he set her down, he gazed at the land stretching around them, their land now, united as they would soon be. It was never just about the ranch, he said softly. It was about finding home. And I found that in you, Louisa Langford. As the Colorado sun warmed the land that had brought them together, Xavier and Louisa sealed their future with a kiss that promised what neither had dared to hope for when they first met. That even in the wild, unforgiving West, love could not only survive but flourish, transforming adversaries into partners, strangers into family, and separate futures into one shared journey.